She's mad. She's real mad. Alright. Here we go. And I'm gonna eat food. Wait, what's going on here?
I'm gonna get stuck. Have you heard that?
Having at you.
Huh?
I'm laughing at you.
You heard that?
Yeah.
Dang it. I'm just being silly because I didn't think you could hear me.
Why can't I hear anything these people are saying?
Question is poor ass. Ew, what's covered in bites? Poor butt.
Oh, here we go. Cheese quesadilla.
On my period.
Ooh. Now I'm gonna have to do stuff again. Where you going?
Addie.
Huh?
Addie.
Mm.
Come on. What's that?
Did you turn off the Xbox?
What?
Did you turn it off?
No.
Weird. Oh, it turned off on its own. That's right. Oh, I'm supposed to hit buttons. Dang it.
person. Already, man. You make me tired, Connie.
What's the matter?
I'm snoring.
Mm,
It's making me tired.
sorry, man. I'm gonna go make about 8 or 9 more quesadillas in a second. You go.
But always a dynamic interplay between two extremes. This point has been emphasized most extensively by the Chinese sages in their symbolism of the archetypal poles yin and yang. They called the unity lying behind yin and yang the Tao, and saw it as a process which brings about their interplay. That which lets now the dark, now the light appear, is Tao. One of the principal polarities at play is the one between the male and female sides of human nature. As with the polarity or of life and death, we tend to feel uncomfortable with the male and female polarity ourselves, and therefore we bring one or the other side into prominence. In Tantric Buddhism, the male-female polarity is often illustrated with the help of sexual symbols. Intuitive wisdom is seen as the passive female polarity. The active male, and the union of both in the process of enlightenment is represented by ecstatic sexual embraces of male and female deities. The Eastern mystics affirm that such a union of one's male and female modes can only be experienced on a higher plane of consciousness, where the realm of thought and language is transcended, and all opposites appear as a dynamic union. A similar plane has been reached in modern times. The exploration of the subatomic is revealing reality which repeatedly transcends language and reason. The unification of concepts which have hitherto seemed opposite and irreconcilable turns out to be one of the most startling features of this new reality. These seemingly irreconcilable concepts are generally not the ones the Eastern mystics are concerned with. Sometimes they are, but their unification at a non-ordinary level of reality provides a parallel to Eastern mysticism. Modern physicists should therefore be able to gain insights into some of the simple teachings of the Far East by relating them to experiences in their own field. A small but growing number of young physicists have indeed found this a most valuable and stimulating approach to Eastern mysticism. Examples of the unification of opposite concepts in modern physics can be found in the subatomic level, where particles are both destructible and indestructible, where matter is both continuous and discontinuous, and force and matter are but different aspects of the same phenomena. In these examples, it turns out that the framework of opposite concepts derived from a is crucial for the description of this world. And in the relativistic framework, the classical concepts are transcended by going to a higher dimension, the four-dimensional space-time. Space and time themselves, which had seemed entirely different, but have been unified in relativistic physics. The four-dimensional relativity theory is not the only example in modern physics where seemingly contradictory and irreconcilable concepts are seen to be nothing more than different aspects of the same reality. Perhaps the most famous case of such a unification of contradictory concepts is that of the concepts of particles and waves in atomic physics. At the atomic level, matter has a dual aspect. It appears as particles and as waves. Which aspect it shows depends on the situation. In some situations, the particle aspect is dominant. In others, the particles behave more like waves.
Dog's gonna go inside.
Is also exempted by light and all other forms of electromagnetic radiation. This dual aspect of matter and radiation is indeed most startling and gave rise to many of the quantum collapses which led to the formulation of quantum theory. The picture of a wave which is always spread out in space is fundamentally different from the particle picture, which implies a sharp location. It has taken physicists a long time to accept the fact that matter manifests itself in ways which seem to be mutually exclusive. That particles are also waves, waves also particles. Remember that these are not real three-dimensional waves like water or sound waves, but are probability waves, abstract mathematical quantities which are related to the probabilities of finding the particles in various places and with various properties. The introduction of probability waves, in a sense, resolves the paradox of particles being waves by putting it in a totally new context. But at the same time, it leads to another pair of opposite concepts, which is even more fundamental, that of existence and non-existence. This pair of opposites, too, is transcended by the atomic reality. We can never say that an atomic particle exists in a certain place, nor can we say that it does not exist. Being a probability pattern, the particle has tendencies to exist in various places and thus manifests a strange kind of physical reality between existence and non-existence. We cannot, therefore, describe the state of the particle in terms of fixed opposite concepts. The particle is not present at a definite place, nor is it absent. It does not change its position, nor does it remain at rest. What changes is the probability pattern, and thus the tendencies of the particle to exist in certain places. The reality of the atomic physicist, like the reality of the Eastern mystic, transcends the narrow framework of opposite concepts, such as force and matter, particles and waves, motion and rest, existence and non-existence. Faced with this reality, physicists and mystics have to adopt a special way of thinking, where the mind is not fixed in the rigid framework of classical logic, but keeps moving and changing its view. In atomic physics, for example, we are now used to applying both the particle and the wave concept in our description of matter. We learn how to play with the two pictures, switching from one to the other and back, in order to cope with the atomic reality. This is precisely the way in which the Eastern mystics think when they try to interpret their experience of a reality beyond opposites. For a better understanding of the relation between pairs and classical concepts, Niels Bohr has introduced the notion of complementarity. He considered the particle picture and the wave picture as two complementary descriptions of the same reality, each of them being only partly correct and having a limited range of application. Each picture is needed to give a full description of the atomic reality. This notion of complementarity has become an essential part of the way physicists think about nature, and Bohr has often suggested that it might be a useful concept also outside the field of physics. In fact, the notion of complementarity proved to be extremely useful 2,500 years ago. Remember that this very concept played an essential role in ancient Chinese thought. It was based on the insight that opposite concepts stand in a polar or complementary relationship to each other. This complementarity of opposites was what the Chinese represented by the archetypal poles yin and yang. The dynamic interplay in which they saw these opposites of all natural phenomena.
Lucky for me, Blaze was outside just long enough to make 2 more quesadillas. I was not gonna use that one.
I said,
Alright then.
Our notions of space and time figure prominently on our map of reality. They serve to order things and events in our environment and are therefore of paramount importance, not only in our everyday life, but also in our attempts to understand nature through science and philosophy. There's no law of physics which does not require the concepts of space and time for its formulation. The profound modification of these basic concepts brought about by relativity theory was, therefore, one of the greatest revolutions in the history of science. Remember that classical physics was based on the notion of an absolute three-dimensional space, independent of the material it contains, and obeying the laws of Euclidean geometry. Time was seen as a separate dimension, which again is absolute and flows at an even rate, independent of the material. In the West, these notions of space and time were so deeply rooted in the minds of philosophers and scientists that they were taken as true and unquestioned properties of nature. They were not decided to change all that. Eastern philosophy, on the other hand, has always maintained that space and time are constructs of the mind. The Eastern mystics treated them like all other intellectual concepts, as relative and illusory. Thus, the ancient Eastern philosophers and scientists already had the attitude which is so basic to relativity theory, the attitude that our notions of geometry are not absolute and unchangeable properties of nature, but intellectual constructions. The same applies to our idea of time. The Eastern mystics linked the notions of both space and time to particular states of consciousness. Being able to go beyond the ordinary state through meditation, they've realized that the conventional notions of space and time are not the ultimate truth. The refined notions of space and time resulting from their mystical experiences to be, in many ways, similar to the notions of quantum physics, as exemplified by the theory of relativity. What is this new view of space and time which emerged from relativity theory? It is based on the discovery that all space and time measurements are relative. The relativity of spatial specifications was, of course, not new. It was well known before Einstein that the position of an object in space can only be defined relative to some other object. This is usually of three coordinates, and the point from which the coordinates are measured may be called the location of the observer. As far as time is concerned, however, the situation in classical physics was entirely different. The temporal order of two events was assumed to be independent of any observer. Specifications referring to time, such as before, after, or simultaneous, were thought to have an absolute any coordinate system. Einstein recognized that temporal specifications too are relative and depend on the observer. In everyday life, the impression that we can arrange the events around us in a neat time sequence is created by the fact that the velocity of light, 186,000 miles per second, is so high compared to any other velocity we experience that we can assume we are observing events at the instant they are occurring. This, however, is incorrect. Light needs some time to travel from the event to the observer. Normally, this time is so short that the propagation can be considered to be instantaneous. But when the observer moves with a high velocity with respect to the observed phenomena, the time span between the occurrence of an event and its observation plays a crucial role in establishing a sequence of events. Einstein realized that in such a case, observers moving at different velocities will order events differently in time. Two events which are seen as occurring simultaneously by one observer may occur in different temporal sequences for others. which takes place in some particular instant for one observer may happen earlier or later for another observer. It is therefore not possible to speak about the universe at a given instant in an absolute way. There is no absolute space independent of the observer. As we previously mentioned, the concepts of space and time are so basic for the description of natural phenomena that their modification entails an alteration of the whole framework we use in physics to describe nature. In the framework, space and time and are connected inseparably. In relativistic physics, we can never talk about space without talking about time, and vice versa. This new framework has to be used whenever phenomena involving high velocities are described. The intimate link between space and time was well known in astronomy in a different context long before relativity theory. Astronomers and astrophysicists deal with extremely large distances, and here again, the fact that light needs some time to travel from the observed object to the observer is important. Because of the finite velocity of light, the astronomer never looks at the universe in its present state, but always looks back into the past. It takes light 8 minutes to travel from the sun to the earth, and hence we see the sun at any moment, as it existed 8 minutes. Similarly, we see the nearest star as it existed 4 years ago. And with our powerful telescopes, we can see galaxies as they existed millions of years ago. The finite velocity of light is by no means a handicap for astronomers, but is a great advantage. It allows them to observe the evolution of stars, star clusters, or galaxies at all stages just by looking out into space. All types of phenomena that happened during the past billions of years can actually be observed somewhere in the skies. Astronomers are thus used to the importance of the link between space and time. What relativity theory tells us is that this link is important not only when we deal with large distances, but also when we deal with high velocities. Whenever we study natural phenomena involving high velocities, we find it very hard to deal with these concepts, both at the level of intuition and ordinary language. For example, in classical physics, it was always assumed that rods in motion and at rest have the same length. Relativity theory has shown that the length of an object depends on its motion relative to the observer, and it changes with the velocity of that motion. The change is such that the object conforms with the direction of its motion. A rod has its maximum length in a frame of reference where it is at rest, and it becomes shorter with increasing velocity relative to the observer. In the scattering experiments of high-energy physics, particles collide with extremely high velocities. The relativistic contraction is so extreme that spherical particles are reduced to pancake shapes. It is important to realize that it makes no sense to ask which is the real length of an object, just as it makes no sense in our everyday life to ask for the real length of somebody's shadow. The shadow is a projection of points in three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional plane, and its length will be different for different angles of projection. Similarly, the length of a moving object is the projection of four-dimensional space-time onto three-dimensional space, and its length is different in different frames of reference. What is true for lengths is also true for time intervals. They too depend on the frame of reference, but contrary to spatial distance, they become longer as the velocity relative to the observer increases. This means that clocks in motion moves. Time slows down. These clocks can be of many types: mechanical clocks, atomic clocks, or even a human heart. One of two twins went on a fast round trip into outer space. He would be younger than his brother when he came back home. All his clocks, his heartbeat, blood flow, brain waves, etc., could slow down during the journey from the point of view of the man on the ground. The traveler himself, of course, would not notice anything unusual, but on his return, he would suddenly realize that his twin brother was now much older. This twin paradox is perhaps the most famous paradox of modern physics. All these relativistic theories only seem strange because we cannot experience the four-dimensional space-time world with our senses. We can only observe its three-dimensional images. These images have different aspects and different frames of reference. Moving objects look different from objects at rest, and moving clocks run at a different rate. These effects will seem paradoxical if we do not realize that they are only the projections of four-dimensional phenomena, just as shadows are projections of three-dimensional objects. If we could visualize the four-dimensional space-time reality, there would be nothing paradoxical at all. As we have said, Eastern mystics seem to be able to attain non-ordinary states of consciousness in which they transcend the three-dimensional world of everyday life to experience a higher multi-dimensional reality. Thus, Sri Aurobindo speaks about a subtle change which makes the sight see in a sort of fourth dimension. Dimensions of these states of consciousness may not be the same as we're dealing with in relativistic physics, but it is striking that they have led the mystics towards notions of time and space.
Thanks, sorry.
Implied by relativity theory. Throughout Eastern mysticism, there seems to be a strong intuition for the space-time character of reality. The fact that space and time are inseparably linked, which is so characteristic of relativistic physics, is stressed again and again. This intuitive notion of space and time has perhaps found its clearest expression in its most far-reaching elaboration. The
Dang, should have got money back.
The Avatamsaka Sutra gives a vivid description of how the world is experienced in the state way. The awareness of an interpenetration of space and time, a perfect expression to describe space-time, is repeatedly emphasized in the sutra and is seen as an essential characteristic of the enlightened state of mind. We have been working within the framework of Einstein's special theory of relativity. The basic features of this framework being the relativity of space and time and their unification into four-dimensional space-time. Now let us again turn to the general theory of relativity, in which the special theory is extended to include. Remember that the effect of gravity is to make space-time curved. Since space can never be separated from time in relativity theory, the curvature caused by gravity cannot be limited to three-dimensional space, but must extend to four-dimensional space-time. This is indeed what the general theory of relativity predicts. In a curved space-time, caused by the curvature effect, not only the spatial relationships described by geometry, but also the lengths of time intervals. Time does not flow at the same rate as in flat space-time, and as the curvature varies from place to place according to the distribution of massive bodies, so does the flow of time. However, it is important to realize that this variation, flow of time, can only be seen by an observer who remains in a different place from the clocks used to measure the variation. For example, if the observer went to a place where time flows slower, all of her clocks would slow down too, and she would have no means of measuring the effect. In order to measure the effect,
Ooh, they're gonna get in trouble.
How it came to be written. One day, in the spring of 1959, the British Broadcasting Corporation invited me to interview for British television Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. The interview was to be done in depth. I knew little enough at that time about Jung and his work, and I at once went to make his acquaintance at his beautiful lakeside home in Zurich. That was the beginning of a friendship that meant a great deal to me, and, I hope, gave some pleasure to Jung in the last years of his life. The television interview has no further place in this story, except that it was accounted successful. Is by an odd combination of circumstances an end product of that success. One man who saw Jung on the screen was Wolfgang Focus, managing director of Aldous Books. Focus had been keenly interested in the development of modern psychology since his childhood, when he then hid Freud's in Vienna. And as he watched Jung talking about his life and work and ideas, Focus suddenly reflected what a pity it was that, while the general outline of Freud's work was well known to educated readers all over the Western world, Jung had never managed to break through to the general public and was always considered too difficult for popular reading. Focus, in fact, is the creator of Man and His Symbols. Having sensed from the TV screen that
Blaze, stop, dude.
existed between Jung and myself, he asked me whether I would join him in trying to persuade him to set out some of his more important and basic ideas in language and interesting to non-specialist adult readers. I jumped at the idea and set on once more to Zurich, determined that I could convince you of the value and importance of such a work. Jung listened to me in his garden for 2 hours, almost without interruption. Then he said it in the nicest possible way, but with great firmness. He had never, in the past, tried to popularize his work, and he wasn't sure that he could successfully do so now. Anyway, he was old and rather tired, and not keen to take on such a long commitment about which he had so many doubts. Jung's friends got on with me that he was a man of most positive decision. He would weigh up a problem with care and without hurry. But when he did give his answer, it was usually fine. I returned to London greatly disappointed, but convinced that Jung's refusal was the end of the matter. So it might have been, but for 2 intervening factors that I had not foreseen. One was the pertinacity of Focus, who insisted on making one more approach to Jung before accepting defeat. The other was an event that, as I look back on it, still astonishes me. The television program was, as I have said, accounted successful. It brought you a great many all sorts of people, many of them ordinary folk with no medical or psychological training, who had been captivated by the divine.
There you go, good boy. All right, I'm back, baby. Here we go.
Personality, something that was helpful to him. And Hume was very pleased, not simply in getting letters, his mail was enormous at all times, but in getting them from people who were normally having no contact with him. It was at this moment that he dreamed a dream of the greatest importance to him. And as you read this book, you will understand just how important that can be. He dreamed that instead of sitting in his study and talking to the great doctors and psychiatrists who used to call on him from all over the world, he was standing in a public place and addressing a multitude of people who were listening to him with rapt attention and understanding what he said. When, a week or two later, Lopez renewed his request that you should undertake a new book designed not for the clinic or the business, but for the people in the marketplace, Hume allowed himself to be persuaded. He laid down two conditions. First, that the book should not be a single-handed book, but the collective effort of himself and a group of his closest followers, through whom he had attempted to perpetuate his methods and his teaching. Secondly, that I should be entrusted with the task of coordinating the work and resolving any problems that might arise between the authors and the publishers. Lest it should seem that this introduction transgresses the bounds of reasonable modesty, let me say at once that I was gratified by this second condition, but with impression. For it very soon came to my knowledge that Jung's reason for selecting me was essentially that he regarded me as being of reasonable but not exceptional intelligence, and without the slightest serious knowledge of psychology. Thus, I was to Jung the average reader of this book. What I could understand would be intelligible to all who would be interested. What I boggled at might possibly be too difficult or obscure for some. Not unduly flattered by this expectation, I have nonetheless scrupulously insisted, sometimes I fear to the exasperation of the authors, on having every paragraph written, and, if necessary, rewritten, to a degree of clarity and directness that enables me to say with confidence that this book, in its entirety, is designed for and addressed to the general reader, and that the complex subjects it deals with are treated with a rare and encouraging simplicity. After much discussion, the comprehensive subject of the book was agreed to be man and his symbols, and Jung himself selected as his collaborators in the work Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz of Zurich, perhaps his closest professional confidant and friend, Dr. Joseph L. Henderson of San Francisco, one of the most prominent and trusted of American Jungians, Mrs. Aniela Yove of Zurich, who, in addition to being an experienced analyst, was Jung's confidential private secretary and his biographer, and Dr. Jacobi, who, after Jung himself, is the most experienced author among Jung's survivors.
The door is locked.
Partly because of their skill and experience in the particular subjects allocated to them, and partly because all of them were completely trusted by Jung to work unselfishly to his instructions as members of the team. Jung's personal responsibility was to plan the structure of the whole book, to supervise and direct the work of his collaborators, and himself to write the keynote chapter, Approaching the Unconscious. The last year of his life was devoted almost entirely to this book, and when he died in June 1961, his own section was complete. He finished it, in fact, only some 10 days before his final illness, and his colleagues' chapters had all been approved by him in draft. After his death, Dr. von Franz assumed overall responsibility for the completion of the book in accordance with Jung's express instructions. The subject matter of man and his symbols and its outline was therefore laid down and in detail by Jung. The chapter that bears his name is his work, and, apart from some fairly extensive editing to improve its intelligibility to the general reader, nobody else's. It was written, incidentally, in English. The remaining chapters were written by the various authors to Jung's direction and under his supervision. The final editing understanding, and good humor that leave the publishers and myself wrinkling in her debt. Finally, as to the contents of the book itself, Hume's thinking has colored the world of psychology more than many of those with casual knowledge realize. Such familiar terms, for instance, as extrovert, introvert, and archetype, are all Jungian concepts, borrowed and sometimes misused by others. But his overwhelming contribution to psychological understanding is his concept of the unconscious, not like the subconscious of Freud, merely a sort of glory hole of repressed desires, but a world that is just as much a vital and real part of the life of an individual as the conscious, cogitating world of the ego, and infinitely wider and richer. The language and the people of the unconscious are symbols, and the means of communications, dreams. Thus, an examination of man and his symbols is, in effect, an examination of man's relation to his own unconscious. And since, in Jung's view, the unconscious is the great guide, friend, and advisor of the conscious, this book is related in the most direct terms to the study of human beings and their spiritual problems. We know the unconscious and communicate with it, a two-way service, principally by dreams. And all through this book, above all in Jung's own chapter, you will find a quite remarkable emphasis placed on the importance of dreaming in the life of the individual. It would be an impertinence on my part to attempt to interpret Jung's work to read it, many of whom will surely be far better qualified to understand it than I am. My role, remember, was merely to serve as a sort of intelligibility filter, and by no means as an interpreter. Nevertheless, I venture to offer two general points that seem to that may possibly be helpful to other non-experts. The first is about dreams. To Jungians, the dream is not a kind of standardized cryptogram that can be decoded by a glossary of simple meanings. It is an integral, important, and personal expression of the individual unconscious. It is just as real as any other phenomenon attaching to the individual. The dreamer's individual unconscious is communicating with the dreamer alone and is selecting symbols for its purpose that have meaning to the dreamer and to nobody else. Thus, the interpretation of dreams, whether by the analyst or by the dreamer himself, is, for the Jungian psychologist, an entirely personal and individual business, and sometimes an experimental and very lengthy one as well, that can by no means be undertaken by a rule of thumb. The converse of this is that the communications of the unconscious are of the highest importance to the dreamer. Naturally so, since the unconscious is at least half of his total being, and frequently offer him advice or guidance that could be obtained from no other source. Thus, when I described Hume's dream multitude, I was not describing a piece of magic or suggesting that Hume dabbled in fortune telling. I was recounting, in the simple terms of daily experience, how Jung was advised by his own unconscious to reconsider an inadequate judgment he had made with the conscious part of his mind. Now, it follows from this that the dreaming of dreams is not a matter that the well-adjusted Jungian can regard as simply a matter of chance. On the contrary, the ability to establish communication with the unconscious is a part of the whole man, and Jungians teach themselves, I can think of no better term, to be receptive to dreams. When, therefore, Jung himself was faced with the critical decision whether or not to write this book, he was able to draw on the resources of both his conscious and his unconscious in making up his mind. And all through this book, you will find the dream treated as a direct, personal, and meaningful communication to the dreamer. A communication that uses the symbols common to all mankind, but that uses them on every occasion in an entirely individual way that can be interpreted only by an entirely individual key. The second point, a particular characteristic of argumentative method themselves to living entirely in the world of the conscious, and who reject communication with the unconscious, bind themselves by the laws of conscious formal life. With the infallible, but often meaningless, logic of the algebraic equation, they argue from assumed premises to incontestably deduced conclusions. Jung and his colleagues seem to be, whether they know it or not, to reject the limitations of this method of argument. It is not that they ignore logic, but they appear all the time to be arguing to the unconscious as well as to the conscious. Their dialectical method is itself symbolic and often devious. They convince, not by means of the narrowly focused spotlight of the syllogism, but by skirting, by repetition, by presenting a recurring view of the same subject, seen each time from a slightly different angle, until suddenly the reader, who has never been aware of a single conclusive moment of growth, finds that he has unknowingly embraced and taken into himself some mighty truth. Jung's argument, and those of his colleagues, spiral upward over his subject, like a bird circling a tree. At first, in the ground, it sees only a confusion of leaves and branches. Gradually, as it circles higher and higher, the recurring aspects of the tree form a wholeness and relate to their surroundings. Some readers may find this spiraling method of argument obscure or even confusing for a few pages, but not, I think, for long. It is characteristic of Jung's method, and very soon the reader will find it carrying him with it on a persuasive and profoundly absorbing journey. The different sections of this book speak for themselves and require little introduction from me. Jung's own chapter introduces the reader to the unconscious, to the archetypes and symbols that form its language, and to the dreams by which it communicates. Dr. Henderson, in the following chapter, illustrates the appearance of several archetypal patterns in ancient mythology, folk legend, and primitive ritual. Dr. von Franz, in the chapter entitled The Process of Individuation, describes the process by which the conscious and the unconscious within an individual learn to know, respect, and accommodate one another. In a certain sense, this chapter contains not only the crux of the whole book, but perhaps the essence of Jung's philosophy of life. Man becomes whole, integrated, calm, fertile, and happy when, and only when, the process of individuation is complete, when the conscious and the unconscious have learned to live in peace and to complement one another. Mrs. Jaffa, like Dr. Henderson, is concerned with demonstrating in the familiar fabric of the conscious, man's recurring interest in, almost obsession with, the symbols of the unconscious. They have for him a profoundly significant, almost a nourishing and sustaining inner attraction. Whether they occur in the myths and fairy tales that Dr. Henderson analyzes, or in the visual arts, which, as Mrs. Jaffa shows, satisfy and delight us by a constant appeal to the unconscious. Finally, I must say a brief word about Dr. Jacobi's chapter, which is somewhat separate from the rest of the book. It is, in fact, an abbreviated case history of one interesting and successful analysis. The value of such a chapter in a book like this is obvious, but two words are nonetheless necessary. First, as Dr. von Franz points out, there is no such thing as a typical analysis. There can't be, because every dream is a private and individual communication, and no two dreams use the symbols of the unconscious in the same way. So every union analysis is unique, and it is misleading to consider this one, taken from Dr. Jacobi's clinical files, or any other one there is ever made, as representative or typical. All one can say of the case of Henry and his sometimes lurid dreams is that they form one true example of the way in which the Jungian method may be applied to a particular case. Secondly, the full history of even a comparatively uncomplicated case would take a whole book to account. Inevitably, the story of Henry's analysis suffers a little incomplete expression. The references, for instance, to the eating have been somewhat obscured and lent an unnatural and to me unsatisfactory flavour of the occult by being presented out of their full context. Nevertheless, we concluded, and I am sure the reader will agree, that, with the warnings duly given, the clarity, to say nothing of the human interest, of Henry's analysis greatly enriches this book. I began by describing how Jung came to write Man and His Symbols. I end by reminding the reader of what a remarkable, perhaps unique publication this is. Carl Gustav Jung was one of the great doctors of all time and one of the great thinkers of this century. His object always was to help men and women to know themselves, so that by such knowledge and thoughtful self-use, they could lead full, rich, and happy lives. At the very end of his own life, which was as full, rich, and happy as any I have ever encountered, he decided to use the strength that was left to him to address his message to a wider public than he had ever tried to reach before. He completed his task and his life in the same month. This book is his legacy to the broad reading public. Part 1: Approaching the Unconscious by Carl G. Jung. The importance of dreams. Man uses the spoken or written word to express the meaning of what he wants to convey. His language is full of symbols, but he also often employs signs or images that are not strictly descriptive. Some are mere abbreviations or strings of initials, such as UN, UNICEF, or UNESCO. Others are familiar trademarks, the names of patent medicines, badges, or insignia. Although these are meaningless in themselves, they have acquired a recognizable meaning through common usage or deliberate intent. Such things are not symbols. They are signs, and they do no more than denote the objects to which they are attached. What we call a symbol is a term, a name, or even a picture that may be familiar in daily life, yet that possesses specific connotations in addition to its conventional but obvious meaning. It implies something vague, unknown, or hidden from us. Many Cretan monuments, for instance, are marked with the design of the double axe. This is an object that we know, but we do not know its symbolic implications. For another example, take the case of the Indian who, after a visit to England, told his friends at home that the English worship animals because he had found eagles, lions, and oxen in old churches. He was not aware, nor many Christians, that these animals are symbols of the evangelists and are derived from the vision of Ezekiel, and that this, in turn, has an analogy to the Egyptian sun god Horus and his 4 sons. There are, moreover, such objects as the Greek red cross that are no longer confirmed, yet that have a symbolic significance under certain conditions. Precisely what they symbolize is still a matter of controversial speculation. Thus, a word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. It has a wider, unconscious aspect that is never precisely defined or fully explained. Nor can one hope to define or explain it. As the mind explores the symbol, it is led to ideas that lie beyond the grasp of reason. We may lead our thoughts toward the concept of the divine self, but at this point, reason must admit its incompetence. Man is unable to define a divine being. When, with all our intellectual limitations, we call something divine, we have merely given it a name, which may be based on a creed, but never on factual evidence. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic terms to represent concepts that we cannot define or fully comprehend. This is one reason why all religions employ symbolic language or images. But this conscious use of symbols is only one aspect of a psychological fact of great importance. Man also produces symbols unconsciously and spontaneously in the form must be grasped if we're to know more about the ways in which the human mind works. Man, as we realize, if we reflect for a moment, never perceives anything fully or comprehends anything completely. He can see, hear, touch, and taste. But how far he sees, how well he hears, what his touch tells him, and what he tastes, depend upon
Hey, Stephanie.
of his senses.
Stephanie, this game involves the omniverse,
I don't even know what that means.
like unlimited realities, universes with copies of people.
Oh, that's cool.
That's nuts.
For example, he can extend the range of his vision by binoculars, or of his hearing by electrical amplification. But the most elaborate apparatus cannot do more than bring distant or small objects within range of his eyes, or make faint sounds more audible. No matter what instruments he uses, at some point he reaches the edge of certainty beyond which conscious knowledge cannot pass. There are, moreover, unconscious aspects of our perception of reality. The first is the fact that even when our senses react to phenomena, sights and sounds, they are somehow translated from the realm of reality into that of the mind. Within the mind, they become psychic events whose ultimate nature is unknowable, for the psyche cannot know its own psychical substance. Thus, every experience contains an indefinite number of unknown factors, not to speak of the fact that every concrete object is always unknown in certain respects, because we cannot know the ultimate nature of matter itself. Then there are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally, without our conscious knowledge. We can become aware of such happenings only in a moment of intuition, or by a process of profound thought that leads to a later realization that they must have happened. And though we may have originally ignored their emotion and vital importance, it later wells up from the unconscious as a sort of afterthought. It may appear, for instance, in the form of a dream as a general rule. The unconscious aspect of any event is revealed to us in dreams, where it appears not as a rational thought, but as a symbolic image. As a matter of history, it was the study of dreams that first enabled psychologists to investigate the unconscious aspect of conscious psychic events. It is on such evidence that psychologists assume the existence of an unconscious psyche, though many scientists and philosophers deny its existence. They argue naively that such an assumption implies the existence of two subjects. To put it in a common phrase, two personalities within the same individual. But this is exactly what it does imply, quite correctly. And it is one of the curses of modern man that many people suffer from this divided personality. It is by no means a pathological symptom. It is a normal fact that can be observed at any time and everywhere. It is not merely the neurotic whose right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. This predicament is a symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the undeniable common inheritance of all mankind. Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously, in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, which is arbitrarily dated from the invention of script in about 4000 BC. And this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. What we call the psyche is by no means identical with our consciousness and its contents. Whoever denies the existence of the unconscious is, in fact, assuming that our present knowledge of the psyche is total. And this belief is clearly just as false as the assumption that we know all there is to be known about the natural universe. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is as limitless. Thus, we cannot
Bum,
define
bum,
either the psyche or the nature. We can merely state what we believe them to be and describe, as best we can, how they function. Quite apart, therefore, from the evidence that medical research has accumulated, there are strong grounds of logic for rejecting statements like, there is no unconscious. Those who say such things merely express an age-old misanthropy, a fear of the new and the unknown. There are historical reasons for this resistance to the idea of an unknown part of the human psyche. Consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul, which means, as the name indicates, a noticeable disruption, or more technically, a dissociation of consciousness. Among such people, whose consciousness is at a different level of development from ours, the soul, or psyche, is not felt to be a unit. Many primitives assume that a man has a bush soul, as well as his own, and that this bush soul is incarnate in a wild animal or a tree, with which the human individual has some kind of psychic identity. This is what the distinguished French ethnologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl called a mystical participation. He later retracted this term under pressure of adverse criticism, but I believe that his critics were wrong. It is a well-known psychological fact that an individual may have such an unconscious identity with some other person or object. This identity takes a variety of forms among primitives. If the bush soul is that of an animal, the animal itself is considered as some sort of brother to the man. A man whose brother is a crocodile, for instance, is supposed to be safe when swimming in a crocodile-infested river. If the bush soul is a tree, the tree is presumed to have something like parental authority over the individual concerned. In both cases, an injury to the bush soul is interpreted as an injury to the man. In some tribes, it is assumed that a man has a number of souls. This belief expresses the feeling of some primitive individuals that they each consist of several linked but distinct units. This means that the individual psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fragment only too easily under the onslaught of unchecked emotions. While this situation is familiar to us from the studies of anthropologists, it is also irrelevant to our own advanced civilization as it might seem. We too can become dissociated and lose our identity. We can be possessed and altered by moods, or become unreasonable and unable to recall important facts about ourselves or others, so that people ask, what the devil has got into you? We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is a rare and remarkable virtue. We may think we have ourselves under control, yet a friend can easily tell us things about ourselves of which we have no knowledge. Beyond doubt, even in what we call a high level of civilization, human consciousness has not yet achieved a reasonable degree of continuity. It is still vulnerable and liable to fragmentation. This capacity to isolate part of one's mind, indeed, is a valuable characteristic. It enables us to concentrate upon one thing at a time, excluding everything else that may claim our attention. But there is a world of difference between a conscious decision to split off and temporarily suppress a part of one's psyche, and a condition in which this happens spontaneously, without one's knowledge or consent, and even against one's intention. The former is a civilized achievement, the latter a primitive loss of a soul, or even the pathological cause of a neurosis. Thus, even in our day, the unity of consciousness is still a doubtful affair. It can too easily be disrupted. An ability to control one's emotions that may be very desirable from one point of view would be a questionable accomplishment from another, for it would deprive social intercourse of variety, colour, and warmth. It is a
against this background that we must review the importance of dreams. Those flimsy, evasive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain fantasies. To explain my point of view, I would like to describe how it developed over a period of years, and how I was led to conclude that dreams are the most frequent and universal source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty. Sigmund Freud was the pioneer who first tried to explore empirically the unconscious background of consciousness. He worked on the general assumption that dreams are not a matter of chance, but are associated with conscious thoughts and problems. This assumption was not in the least arbitrary. It was based upon the conclusion of eminent neurologists, for instance Pierre Janet, that neurotic symptoms are related to some conscious experience. They even appear to be split off areas of the conscious mind, which, at another time and under different conditions, can be conscious. Before the beginning of this century, Freud and Joseph Breuer had recognized that neurotic symptoms, hysteria, certain types of pain, and abnormal behavior are in fact symbolically meaningful. They are one way in which the unconscious mind expresses itself, just as it may in dreams, and they are equally symbolic. A patient, for instance, who is confronted with an intolerable situation may develop a spasm whenever he tries to swallow. He can't swallow it. Under similar conditions of psychological stress, another patient has an attack of asthma. He can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A third suffers from a peculiar paralysis of the legs. He can't walk, i.e., he can't go on anymore. A fourth, who vomits when he eats, cannot digest some unpleasant fact. I could cite many examples of this kind, but such physical reactions are only one form in which the problems that trouble us unconsciously may express themselves. They more often find expression in our dreams. Any psychologist who has listened to numbers of people describing their dreams knows that dream symbols have much greater variety than the physical symptoms of neurosis. They often consist of elaborate and picturesque fantasies. But if the analyst who is confronted by this dream material uses Freud's original technique of free association, he finds that dreams can eventually be reduced to certain basic patterns. This technique played an important part in the development of psychoanalysis, for it enabled Freud to use dreams as the starting point from which the unconscious problem of the patient might be explored.
I went back the wrong way.
But penetrating observation that if the dreamer is encouraged to go on talking about his dream images and the thoughts that these prompt in his mind, he will give himself away and reveal the unconscious background
Yeah,
of his
I'm now.
in both
Actually, yeah, I got there.
and what he deliberately omits saying. His ideas may seem irrational and irrelevant, but after a time, it becomes relatively easy to see what it is that he is trying to avoid, what unpleasant thought or experience he is suppressing. No matter how he tries to camouflage it, everything he says points to the core of his predicament. A doctor sees so many things from the seamy side of life that he is seldom far from the truth when he interprets the hints that his patient produces as signs of an uneasy conscience. What he eventually discovers, unfortunately, confirms his expectations. Thus far, nobody can say anything against Freud's theory of repression and wish fulfillment as apparent causes of dream symbolism. Freud attached particular importance to dreams as the point of departure for a process of free association. But after a time, I began to feel that this was a misleading and inadequate use of the rich fantasies that the unconscious produces in sleep. My doubts really began when a colleague told me of an experience he had during the course of a long train journey in Russia. Though he did not know the language and could not even decipher the Cyrillic script, he found himself musing over the strange letters in which the railway notices were written, and he fell into a reverie in which he imagined all sorts of meanings for them. One idea led to another, and in his relaxed mood, he found that his free association had stirred up many old memories. Among them, he was annoyed to find some long-buried disagreeable topics. things he had wished to forget and had forgotten consciously. He had, in fact, arrived at what psychologists would call his complexes. That is, repressed emotional themes that can cause constant psychological disturbances, or even, in many cases, the symptoms of a neurosis. This episode opened my eyes to the fact that it was not necessary to use a dream as the point of departure for the process of free association if one wished to discover the complexes of a patient. It showed me that one can reach the center directly from any point of the compass. One could begin from Cyrillic letters, from meditations upon a crystal ball, a prayer wheel, or upon a painting, or even from casual conversation about some trivial event. The dream was no more and no less useful in this respect than any other possible starting point. Nevertheless, dreams have a particular significance, even though they often arise from an emotional upset in which the habitual complexes are also involved. The habitual complexes are the tender spots of the psyche which react most quickly to an external stimulus or disturbance. That is why free association can lead one from any dream to the critical secret thoughts. At this point, however, it occurred to me that, if I was right so far, it might reasonably follow that dreams have some special and more significant.
So there's really no point to come back here, huh?
Very often, dreams have a definite, evidently purposeful structure, indicating an underlying idea or intention, though, as a rule, the latter is not immediately comprehensible. I therefore began to consider whether one should pay more attention to the actual form and content of a dream, rather than allowing free association to lead one off through a train of ideas to complexes that could as easily be reached by other means. This new thought was a turning point in the development of my psychology. It meant that I gradually gave up following associations that led far away from the text of a dream. I chose to concentrate rather on the associations to the dream itself, believing that the latter expressed something specific that the unconscious was trying to say. The change in my attitude toward dreams involved a change of method. The new technique was one that could take account of all the various wider aspects of a dream. A story told by the conscious mind has a beginning, a development, and an end. But the same is not true of a dream. Its dimensions in time and space are quite different. To understand it, you must examine it from every aspect, just as you may take an unknown object in your hands and turn it over and over until you are familiar with every detail of its shape. Perhaps I have now said enough to show how I came increasingly to disagree with free association as Freud first employed it. I wanted to keep as close as possible to the dream itself, and to exclude all the irrelevant ideas and associations that it might evoke. True, these could lead one toward the complexes of a patient, but I had a more far-reaching purpose in mind than the discovery of complexes that cause neurotic disturbances. There are many other means by which these can be identified. The psychologist, for instance, can get all the hints he needs by using word association tests, by asking the patient what he associates to a given set of words, and by studying his responses. But to know and understand the psychic life process of an individual's whole personality, it is important to realize that his dreams and their symbolic images have a much more important role to play. Almost everyone knows, for example, that there is an enormous variety of images by which the sexual act can be symbolized, or, one might say, represented in the form of an allegory. Each of these images can lead, by a process of association, to the idea of sexual intercourse and to specific complexes that any individual may have about his own sexual relationships. But one could just as well unearth such complexes by daydreaming on a set of indecipherable Russian letters. I was thus led to the assumption that a dream can contain some message other than the sexual allegory, and that it does so for definite reasons. To illustrate this point, a man may dream of inserting a key in a lock, of wielding a heavy stick, or of breaking down a door with a battering ram. Each of these can be regarded as a sexual allegory. But the fact that he's unconscious for its own purposes has chosen one of these specific images, it may be the key, the stick, or the battering ram, is also of major significance. The real task is to understand why the key has been preferred to the stick, or the stick to the ram. And sometimes this might even lead one to discover that it is not the sexual act at all that is represented, but some quite different psychological point. From this line of reasoning, I concluded that only the material that is clearly and visibly part of a dream should be used in interpreting it. The dream has its own limitation. Its specific form itself tells us what belongs to it and what leads away from it. While free association lures one away from that material in a kind of zigzag line, the method I evolved is more like a circumambulation whose center is the dream picture. I work all around the dream picture and disregard every attempt that the dreamer makes to break away from it. Time and time again, in my professional work, I have had to repeat the words, "Let's get back to your dream. What does the dream say?" For instance, a patient of mine dreamed of a drunken and
Stupid.
In the dream, it seemed that this woman was his wife, though in real life, his wife was totally different. On the surface, therefore, the dream was shockingly untrue, and the patient immediately rejected it as dream nonsense. If I, as his doctor, had let him start a process of association, he would inevitably have tried to get as far away as possible from the unpleasant suggestion of his dream. In that case, he would have ended with one of his staple complexes, a complex possibly that had nothing to do with his wife, and we should have learned nothing about the special meaning of this particular dream. What then was his unconscious trying to convey by such an obviously untrue statement? Clearly, it somehow expressed the idea of a degenerate female who was closely connected with the dreamer's life. But since the projection of this image onto his wife was unjustified and factually untrue, I had to look elsewhere before I found out what this repulsive image represented. In the Middle Ages, long before the physiologists demonstrated that by reason of our glandular structure, there are both male and female elements in all of us, it was said that every man carries a woman within himself. It is this female element in every male that I have called the anima. This feminine aspect is essentially a certain inferior kind of relatedness to the surroundings, and particularly to women, which is kept carefully concealed from others as well as from oneself. In other words, though an individual's visible personality may seem quite normal, he may well be concealing from others, or even from himself, the deplorable condition of the woman within. That was the case with this particular patient. His female side was not nice. His dream was actually saying to him, "You are in some respects behaving like a degenerate female," and thus gave him an appropriate shock. An example of this kind, of course, must not be taken as evidence that the unconscious is concerned with moral injunctions. The dream was not telling the patient to behave better, but was simply trying to balance the lopsided nature of his conscious mind, which was maintaining the fiction that he was a perfect gentleman throughout. It is easy to understand why dreamers tend to ignore and even deny the message of their dreams. Consciousness naturally resists anything unconscious and unknown. I have already pointed out the existence among primitive peoples of what anthropologists call misonesia, a deep and superstitious fear of novelty. The primitives manifest all the reactions of the wild animal against untoward events. But civilized man reacts to new ideas in much the same way, erecting psychological barriers to protect himself from the shock of facing something new. This can easily be observed in any individual's reaction to his own dreams when obliged to admit a surprising thought. Many pioneers in philosophy, science, and even literature have been victims of the innate conservatism of their contemporaries. Psychology is one of the youngest of the sciences. Because it attempts to deal with the working of the unconscious, it has inevitably encountered misonesia in an extreme form. Past and future in the unconscious. So far, I have been sketching some of the principles on which I approach the problem of dreams. For when we want to investigate man's faculty to produce symbols, dreams prove to be the most basic and accessible material for this purpose. The two fundamental points in dealing with dreams are these. First, the dream should be treated as a fact, about which one must make no previous assumption except that it somehow makes sense. And second, the dream is a specific expression of the unconscious.
I don't get that.
One could scarcely put these principles more modestly. No matter how low anyone's opinion of the unconscious may be, he must concede that it is worth investigating. The unconscious is, at least, on a level with the louse, which, after all, enjoys the honest interest of the entomologist. With little experience and knowledge of dreams, thinks that dreams are just chaotic occurrences without meaning. He's at liberty to do so. But if one assumes that they are normal events, which as a matter of fact they are, one is bound to consider that they are either causal, i.e. that there is a rational cause for their existence, or in a small way, purposive, or both. Let us now look a little more closely at the ways in which the conscious and unconscious contents of the mind link together. Take an example with which everyone is familiar. Suddenly you find you can't remember what you were going to say next, though a moment ago the thought was perfectly clear. Or perhaps you are about to introduce a friend, and his name escapes you as you are about to utter it. You say you can't remember. In fact, though, the thought has become unconscious, or at least momentarily separated from consciousness. We find the same phenomenon with our senses. If we listen to a continuous note on the French audibility, the sound seems to stop at regular intervals and then start again. Such oscillations are due to a periodic decrease and increase in one's attention, not to any change in the note. But when something slips out of our consciousness, it does not cease to exist, any more than a car that has disappeared round the corner has vanished into thin air. It is simply out of sight. Just as we may later see the car again, so we come across thoughts that were temporarily lost to us. Thus, part of the unconscious consists of a multitude of temporarily obscured thoughts, impressions, and images that, in spite of being lost, continue to influence our conscious minds. A man who is distracted or absent-minded will walk across the room to fetch something. He stops, seemingly perplexed. He has forgotten what he was after. His hands grope among the objects on the table as if he were sleepwalking. He is oblivious of his original purpose, yet he is unconsciously guided by it. Then he realizes what it is that he wants. His unconscious has prompted him. If you observe the behavior of a neurotic person, you can see him doing many things that he appears to be doing consciously and purposefully. Yet if you ask him about them, you will discover that he is either unconscious of them or has something quite different in mind. He hears and does not hear. He sees, yet is blind. He knows and is ignorant. Such examples are so common that the specialist soon realizes that unconscious contents of the mind behave as if they were conscious, and that you can never be sure in such cases whether thought, speech, or action is conscious or not. It is this kind of behavior that makes so many physicians dismiss statements by hysterical patients as utter lies. Such persons certainly produce more untruths than most of us, but lying is scarcely the right word to use. In fact, their mental state causes an uncertainty of behavior because their consciousness is liable to unpredictable eclipse by interference from the unconscious. Even their skin sensations may reveal similar fluctuations of awareness. At one moment, the hysterical person may feel a needle prick in the arm. At the next, it may pass unnoticed. If his attention can be focused on a certain point, the whole of his body can be completely anesthetized until the tension that causes this blackout of the senses has been relaxed. Sense perception is then immediately restored.
Nice.
All the time, however, he has been unconsciously aware of what was happening. The physician can see this process quite clearly when he hypnotizes such a patient. It is easy to demonstrate that the patient has been aware of every detail. The prick in the arm or the remark made during an eclipse of consciousness can be recalled as accurately as if there had been no anesthesia or forgetfulness. I recall a woman who was once admitted to the clinic in a state of complete stupor. When she recovered consciousness next day, she knew who she was, but did not know where she was, how or why she had come there, or even the date. Yet, after I had hypnotized her, she told me why she had fallen ill, how she had got to the clinic, and who had admitted her. All these details could be verified. She was even able to tell the time at which she had been admitted, because she had seen a clock in the entrance hall. Under hypnosis, her memory was as clear as if she had been completely conscious all the time. When we discuss such matters, we usually have to draw on evidence supplied by clinical observation. For this reason, many critics assume that the unconscious and all its subtle manifestations belong solely to the sphere of psychopathology. They consider any expression of the unconscious as something neurotic or psychotic, which has nothing to do with a normal mental state. But neurotic phenomena are by no means the products exclusively of disease. They are, in fact, no more than pathological exaggerations of normal occurrences. It is only because they are exaggerations that they are more obvious than their normal counterparts. Hysterical symptoms can be observed in all normal persons, but they are so slight that they usually pass unnoticed. Forgetting, for instance, is a normal process in which certain conscious ideas lose their specific energy because one's attention has been deflected. When interest turns elsewhere, it leaves in shadow the things with which one was previously concerned, just as a searchlight lights upon a new area by leaving another in darkness. This is unavoidable, for consciousness can keep only a few images in full clarity at one time, and even this clarity fluctuates. But the forgotten ideas have not ceased to exist. Although they cannot be reproduced at will, they are present in a subliminal state, just beyond the threshold of recall, from which they can rise again spontaneously at any time, often after many years of apparently total oblivion. I am speaking here of things we have consciously seen or heard, and subsequently forgotten. But we all see, hear, smell, and taste many things without noticing them at the time, either because our attention is deflected, or because the stimulus to our senses is too slight to leave a conscious impression. The unconscious, however, has taken note of them, and such subliminal sense perceptions play a significant part in our everyday lives. Without our realizing it, they influence the way in which we react to both events and people. An example of this that I found particularly revealing was provided by a professor who had been walking in the country with one of his pupils, absorbed in serious conversation. Suddenly he noticed that his thoughts were being interrupted by an unexpected flow of memories from his early childhood. He could not account for this distraction. Nothing in what had been said seemed to have any connection with these memories. On looking back, he saw that he had been walking past a farm when the first of these childhood recollections had surged up in his mind. He suggested to his pupil that they should walk back to the point where the fantasies had begun. Once there, he noticed the smell of geese, and instantly he realized that it was this smell that had touched off the flow of memories. In his youth, he had lived on a farm where geese were kept, and their characteristic smell had left a lasting, though forgotten, impression. As he passed the farm on his walk, he had noticed the smell subliminally, and this unconscious perception had called back long-forgotten experiences of his childhood. The perception was subliminal, because the attention was engaged elsewhere, and the stimulus was not strong enough to deflect it, and
Split up.
consciousness directly. Yet it had brought up the forgotten memories. Such a cue, trigger effect, can explain the onset of neurotic symptoms, as well as more benign memories when a sight, smell, or sound recalls a circumstance in the past. A girl, for instance, may be busy in her office, apparently in good health and spirits. A moment later, she develops a blinding headache and shows other signs of distress. Without consciously noticing it, she has heard the foghorn of a distant ship, and this has unconsciously reminded her of an unhappy parting with a lover whom she has been doing her best to forget. Aside from normal forgetting, Freud has described several cases that involve the forgetting of disagreeable memories, memories that one is only too ready to lose. As Nietzsche remarked, where pride is insistent enough, memory refuse to give way. Thus, among the lost memories, we encounter not a few that owe their subliminal state and their incapacity to be voluntarily reproduced to their disagreeable and incompatible nature. The psychologist calls these repressed contexts. A case in point might be that of a secretary who is jealous of one of her employer's associates. She habitually forgets to invite this person to meetings, though the name is clearly marked on the list she is using. But if challenged on the point, she simply says she forgot or was interrupted. She never admits, not even to herself, the real reason for her omission. Many people mistakenly overestimate the role of willpower and think that nothing can happen to their minds that they do not decide and intend.
These kids just want to die.
Carefully between intentional and unintentional contents of the mind. The former are derived from the ego personality. The latter, however, arise from a source that is not identical with the ego, but is its other side. It is this other side that would have made the secretary forget the invitations. There are many reasons why we forget things that we have noticed or experienced, and there are just as many ways in which they may be recalled to mind. An interesting example is that of cryptomnesia, or concealed recollection. An author may be writing steadily to a preconceived plan, working out an argument or developing the line of a story, but he suddenly runs off at a tangent. Perhaps a fresh idea has occurred to him, or a different image, or a whole new subplot. If you ask him what prompted the digression, he will not be able to tell you. He may not even have noticed the change, though he has now produced material that is entirely fresh and apparently unknown to him before. Yet it can sometimes be shown convincingly that what he has written bears a striking similarity to the work of another author, a work that he believes he has never seen. I myself found a fascinating example of this in Nietzsche's book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, where the author reproduces almost word for word an incident reported in a ship's log for the year 1686. By sheer chance, I had read this seaman's yarn in a book published about 1835, half a century before Nietzsche wrote. And when I found the similar passage in Thus Spake Zarathustra, I was struck by its peculiar style, which was different from Nietzsche's usual language. I was convinced that Nietzsche must also have seen the old book.
Watch out, homie. It's about cereal o'clock. Oh, son of a... Dang, I suck. Let's try that again. Ooh. I'm gonna open that door. Punks. All this just so these dudes can get rid of that stupid thing. Nobody even asked me to do it, I just did it. But Where's your flashlight at, dude? She's dead. It's ghosts. Oh my. What a shame.
What happened?
Somebody died in my game.
Can you